Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. This is episode number 110. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined by a very special guest, an oft requested guest, in fact. Tom from Moore's Law is dead. Bring a little hardware expertise into our lives for once. How's it going, Tom?
It's going pretty well. I actually have my Sony engineering shirt on just
Yeah, it's
for
dope.
this. I got a couple things in the background that I can reference at least to describe to you. Most people I know I probably, or if not all, are listening via audio most likely. But yeah, I mean, I got the Sony shirt. I got an AMD shirt and an Intel shirt. Nvidia and Microsoft, of course, never sent me anything, but it is what it is.
You look great. I appreciate you being here in your stylish shirt in your awesome office. You're in Illinois, right? Is that where it
I
is?
was in Illinois. What makes you say that, though? Is there anything still on my website saying I still am?
I was looking at your YouTube about,
Oh, no.
and there was a link to a PO box in Illinois, so that's why I was curious. And I know you're Central Time, so I just didn't know if that was where you
I see
are.
it. All right. Yep. Now I need to change that to Nashville.
Yeah.
So I actually live in Nashville now. I moved here
Oh,
3
okay, cool.
months ago. Thank you for correcting an error on my YouTube channel. That's
No,
good.
you're very welcome. That was the entire intent. So I'm happy to be able to help you. But I had a really great time on your podcast about a month ago. We had a really great conversation, and my audience is really fond of you. When you come up, because
Oh.
every once in a while we actually read your submissions on Sacred Symbols, and people are like, "Oh shit, I'm a big fan of Tom's. I'm a big fan of Moore's Law is Dead. Can we get him on the show?" And I'm like, "Of course." And so I did your show first. We finally have a coordinator on our end, my girlfriend Micah. So we were able to work out a schedule that is coherent and not just in my mind. And so now finally we can have guests on a regular basis. And so we wanted to have Tom over. Tom, we have like a litany of inquiries from the audience about
I,
hardware
I
related
could not
things.
be more excited to talk about all of them.
Yeah, so I shared this with you. You shared your document, your planning document with me too when I was on your show. I always have to kind of feel out how everyone like some people don't want to know. Like I'm one of those guys that's
Hmm.
just like I'm fine, like whatever. And some because then I feel like I'm going to prepare and not say what I wanted to say, and I'm going to get hung up on that, et cetera, and so on. You're a much more preparatory guy. I shared with you some of these inquiries. I think they're going to give us really fun directions to go in, and we're going to go into places that, frankly, I don't want to say Dustin and Chris are much more knowledgeable. I can't speak from a hardware perspective. I speak about games from a design perspective, from a playability perspective, software. That's my wheelhouse. I don't pretend or put on any airs that I know anything about hardware. It's never been important to me, and I know that that's a blind spot for me. So this is why we wanted to have you on. So first of all, I want to thank you for that, and second of all, tell the audience, for those that aren't familiar with you, who you are before we get into everything, so they can understand your bona fides and know that they should listen very carefully.
Well, I'll say I'm not going to talk about anything that I'm not sure I know. And when I do my channel, Moore's Law is Dead, the YouTube channel, this podcast, Broken Silicon, I try to go more in depth than I feel most gaming websites, such as like IGN or GameStop. GameStop always do that. GameSpot
I do that
typically
too.
would. But I don't go crazy in depth, and it's because I'm not a hardware engineer. I majored in mechanical engineering, but I don't claim to be someone who actually designs these things. I mean, I actually did some PCB design and programming, but I think that allows the Moore's Law is Dead YouTube channel to be more technical than otherwise you would see from most, I guess you'd say, news outlets, but not too technical that most people probably can't understand it, because I'm only going as deep as I can go. I have experts that I consult now, which is really helpful. But yeah, I think it honestly acts like a bridge for people who want to know more about what's actually going on in the background on their gaming hardware and the gaming industry. Honestly, very similar to how you are not afraid to really just throw out ideas about what's going on that I feel like most outlets are afraid to talk about. And so yeah, I mean, Moore's Law is Dead is the YouTube channel. It's very hard for me to even describe. It's all AMD, Intel, Nvidia mostly, but then also a lot of PlayStation, Xbox. I just did a Nintendo Super Switch leak, so I'm also starting to talk about Nintendo now.
Cool.
Um, and yeah, but so I'm only as much of an expert as I will claim to be on each question. And look at that, I couldn't even put the correct PO box, so I make mistakes.
No, of course. I mean, first of all, it's funny. I was thinking about this. Compared to me, I'm like an ant, and you are like, Da Vinci in terms of like our understanding of these particular issues, right? But I was thinking the reference I always use in my own mind, and I guess I haven't shared it, is when I was a freshman at Northeastern, I took a math class, and I walk in, I was just signed up for this like freshman math class, and I walk in, and they're doing all this stuff, and I realized I dropped the class that day because I was like, I'm not even prepared to understand this. There's so much I don't even understand that leads up to this that I have no business in this space. So yeah, when it comes to hardware, your expertise is much appreciated, and I appreciate your candor as well that you don't know everything. Neither do I.
Well,
So yeah,
I try to focus on like the patterns in the hardware and the greater scope of how we can predict it will perform in my leaks. But I never try to go into like cache design of the latest Intel processor. And there are some tech tubers that I know are educated in that. But so it's most of, oh, well, let's look at these specs. Who do I know at AMD that can confirm the overall performance, and less of the, well, this exact pixel fill rate because of this new cache structure? Like, I don't go into that.
sure, yeah, and I wouldn't even know what questions to ask in that frame too. So that's totally fine with me. I want to start from a very high level before we even get into the inquiries. We know now that there are 10 million PlayStation 5s in the wild, and predictions from decent sources are we're looking at like 6.5 million Xbox Series X and Series S. I'm just curious how you feel about how everything's going on. We're a PlayStation podcast, of course, but
Mhm.
that doesn't matter. You know that we're incredibly critical of Sony all the time, probably so much so that that's part of the reason they don't ever want to deal with us. So tell it how it is, how you see it, but how are you feeling about the way everything's kind of set up right now?
Well, first of all, just from a frame of reference, I was just preparing. When this is out, there should already be the new Broken Silicon podcast episode out. I was listening to a part of it where me and my brother were just laughing about how horrible like some new product is from AMD. So yeah, they also hate talking to us. If anyone's wondering, like we really don't get anything for free from them. Um, and I totally agree that no podcast is more critical of PlayStation than your PlayStation podcast. I would argue.
Thank you.
Having said that, I feel like this is by far a more interesting generation at the very least than the previous one. By far. I'm so excited that I had this YouTube channel by the time this started, because I always felt like I just always don't feel like the conversation around, well, whether it's, Sega, but in the past, but Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo products are really intelligent enough and really miss some really big, like before the PS4 and the Xbox One launch, so many people were like, well, this is going to be a 50-50 split generation. I remember going, yeah, I don't think so. You're just saying that because the last gen was. And now everyone's like, the PS5 is for sure going to just destroy everything because they did last gen. And is that correct though? The Xbox Series is selling 6.5 million versus 10.
Well, we saw what's that guy's name? Daniel Juge or whatever, Juge X or whatever on Twitter. He's like the industry analyst.
Okay.
That and so he they Microsoft hasn't talked numbers
Right.
specifically regularly, as we know, since the Xbox 360 days. I think
That's
they
why I'm
only
so
spoke about number.
curious.
Yeah, so they have some sort of reference material in which they're like pretty
Mm,
comfortable saying like this is 6.5 million or so sold. I trust that source, but we don't really know. My indication is that Microsoft, the numbers are, I don't want to say soft. I don't think that's true. Microsoft only speaks in platitudes though these days.
mm.
This is the best selling console. We have the highest connectivity. We have 40% more sales. So we don't really know. So that's the best we can do. We know for sure the 10 million unit sold,
Yeah.
and we can kind of assume that Xbox sales are below that just because I think they would have said otherwise.
Well, but let's put that in perspective. So I think everyone was like, oh, the PS5 for sure will just massively outsell the Series X because they did last gen. I mean, the PS4 over doubled the sales, I believe, of the Xbox One. And yet here we are early in a generation when Sony has so much momentum behind them. And I know it doesn't sound good to some people, but the fact that the Xbox is not being outsold 2-1, if that's true, is a huge indicator of how much better a job Microsoft is doing this generation than the last one. And I guess that's my answer to your overall question that I've taken like 5 detours off of, which is that this generation is far more competitive, far more interesting and far more of a performance uplift than the previous gen was over the one before it. I don't know that it's like as big as like PS2 to PS3. I mean, that was comically more powerful, but it's 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 better than I expected when I first started hearing rumors about what were going to be in them, and I think it's proven to be the best one of the better generations to get into console gaming for sure.
Yeah, it's great. It's also, as you said, conventional wisdom suggests things that don't end up happening. And I just often like to reflect on, and I think it's something we spoke about on your show, just how amazing it is that we have consoles still, not because it's amazing in the moment, but because when you look at conventional wisdom 10 years ago, it was like, oh, of course you won't be playing. You'll be playing on some universal box, in 2021. That's what everyone was saying in 2010. So it's just from that perspective, it's nice that we still have the same ecosystem that we can enjoy and have some sort of competition in.
Well, they also predicted that smartphones were going to kill both PC and console because, now this new thing's selling well. That must mean it's always going to sell well, which is what conventional wisdom is half the time.
Sure, that's totally true. I've been wrong about a million things. So, um, I think when you speak enough, you put things into the ether that just don't end up becoming true by rule. But
Oh,
by the way,
yes.
I wanted to say real quick, Daniel Ahmad is the guy's name.
Okay.
If people want to look, it's ZHUGEX on Twitter. He's blocked me a long time ago. I don't know why, but he has like 150,000 followers, and he's a senior analyst at Nico Partners in London. So he's like one of these guys that just reads the tea leaves. So I now that we've gotten that out of the way, I wanted to ask you, Tom, I wanted to just ask about PS5 and Xbox Series X through this lens. Ruben Barrett wrote in on Patreon, as so many of you do, and we appreciate you. Says, hey guys, I guess it's a simple question, but what is the difference between a PS5 and an Xbox Series X? The Series X has more power, right? But the PS5 loads faster. They seem essentially the same to me, but I'm sure there's a few things different. I wanted to pitch this to you because now that the machines have been in the wild for more than half a year, what is what is it that's different about these consoles? How do we describe the difference between them now that we understand them in a greater sense than simply statistics on a page?
Well,
How would you look at the difference between them?
one of them is more of like a rectangle shape, and then
Yeah.
the other one, I mean, that's honestly one of no, there's a lot of different differences in there. They both co-developed their SoCs with AMD, but there's that only means they were both playing with Legos. The Legos can build very different castles, and the funny thing is, though, they seem to have very similar performance objectives because they are, and that's what I will say right off the bat here, very similar in performance on average. The overwhelming majority of games for the next year will perform roughly the same on them. They are well matched, I believe. Far better, far better than the previous gen. Um, but besides that, I mean, no, the Xbox Series X isn't more powerful. I mean, the PS5 has a higher pixel fill rate, a higher triangle raster rate. It's got a unified memory system that part of the segment has less bandwidth, but part of it has more bandwidth than another part of the Xbox's system. The Xbox Series X is a slightly faster CPU, but it's like 3%, and the PS5 has more co-processors, so you don't need to use the CPU for as much. And so all of that is to say, I mean, they have the same amount of ROPs, which is very important for drawing pixels. Okay, so that's the same. But then in the shader arrays, the Xbox has more shaders. That's where they get the higher teraflops number that they wouldn't stop talking about for a while. Okay, but if it's the same amount of ROPs, and then one of them's clocked significantly faster, meaning everything inside that system, the cache, yeah, everything in there is just running faster. There's going to be some scenes where the PS5's raw performance is actually better. There's going to be some scenes where the Xbox's is better. The Xbox probably has a slight ray tracing advantage in third-party games, although jury's out on what, Naughty Dog will accomplish. Um, and so that's it. I mean, I think their rendering grunt's pretty similar. I think that the bandwidth is pretty similar. And I think that the SSD and the IO and the PS5 is an entire generation better than the Xbox Series X.
Is there anything they're going to be able to do at Microsoft to remedy that SSD advantage? It seems like kind of an Achilles heel built into the Xbox that PlayStation can substantially build on that they're unable to do.
Well, when it comes to loading, I think that if people really utilize the Xbox very, very well, that they will have the equivalent of a top of the line PC SSD right now. So it's not like it's slow, and they do have their own co-processors for directing some of the data. So in terms of remedying it, I think conventional games, it won't be a big issue. It's going to be like in Resident Evil 8, where it like loads in 8 seconds instead of 2 seconds on the PS5. But that's it. In terms of like streaming and assets, if that really does happen, like Mark Cerny promised us and it hasn't proven yet, which actually frustrates me, um, then I don't know. I think they'll just update the Xbox. There's really nothing you can do when you just have half as many IO controllers and a slower SSD. A slower SSD, they're charging what, like $200, 250 for? I don't know that there's much they can do except bring out a newer one that's faster, which they're going to. So
Yeah, I also wonder. We didn't get any questions about this, which I was maybe it's not a huge surprise because people want to get into the real nuts and bolts. But I have to ask you. I'd be loath not to ask you. Do you feel like there's a substantial hardware differentiator in the controllers? Because I feel like I know Microsoft has been very complimentary of DualSense. I must say that DualSense is incredible. I think it's an actually incredible piece of hardware. I don't know how to describe it. There seems to be a lot of bits and bolts in it that I quite don't understand. It's almost amazing. I'm like, this is when I'm playing Astro or something that
yeah.
really utilizes it. I was like, wow, this is so amazing. Is that another hardware advantage that you feel like Sony has? Do you feel like Microsoft needs to answer that as well? I mean, what has been your experience on that front?
I would honestly say that the short answer is yes. It is, of course, a hardware advantage, but is it a marketable hardware advantage? I guess the short answer for that's probably also yes, but I don't see enough people talk about it. And it's not a hardware advantage that's going to sway over any Xbox fans who swear by the Xbox controllers. I mean, I mostly game on PC, so I'm fine using a non PS5 controller, but whenever I do use a PS5, it often sticks out to me as, oh, that's cool. Like I was just playing Chivalry 2, and like there was like resistance when holding up a shield when fighting when you're low on health, and I was like, that's really kind of really cool. I think it's cool. I think that we're getting to a point where people don't care as much about graphics, and so having a cooler controller is the most logical thing to do right away because people actually know that. But in terms of if it was worth it or not, I don't know. I think it was. I'm glad they did it. I don't know what else to say besides that.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you in the sense that I look at well, I love what you said. I should back up. I love what you said about how is it marketable. It
Mhm.
reminds me a lot of PSVR in the sense that I don't know how to tell you that this matters until you use it yourself. But I was kind of blown away by me ignoring Rumble for so long as just being this built-in thing that they could even do more with it. Because you think about Rumble's introduction on N64, and it's just like, and then they have the dual shot controller, and so it's kind of distributed, and that was it for like
Yeah.
20 years. That was literally it. And now there's just revolution in input in that way that I just didn't anticipate. So I think that is the frustrating thing for Sony, for them, I would assume, is that we can't show you that this controller is better because we also have a bad reputation as Sony. I'm talking from their perspective of not having a great controller. So why would you expect that we have a good controller now? We never did.
Yeah, I don't
And
know how
yeah,
fair that is, though, that they get
hmm,
that reputation. I mean, if you think about it, the original PS1 with dual analog sticks just invented the modern controller. So this
sure.
idea that they're bad at it when Nintendo, meanwhile, was designing what I assume was a controller built for an alien overlord that has 3 arms. I'm not really sure what they
I
were
hated the
smoking.
N64 controller. I
Um,
hated it.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
at the time, it had an analog stick. It was better than the Sega Genesis that I,
sure.
so it seemed decent at the time. Uh, the one thing I would say for people that want me to say something positive about if it's marketable, the DualSense, is that every time I ask a developer, they're like, it's amazing. Every time I talk to someone who's actually played the PS5, they bring up the DualSense first. So I don't know how marketable it is in ads, but at least in terms of word of mouth, it's like the first thing people bring up, I've noticed.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point too. And I think that baking in Astro was a smart move to immediately
The,
show you
y-
the actual depth
you
of
know
it.
the comedian Ron Funches?
Yeah,
So I just saw him at Zany's in Nashville, and he brought up the PS5 and the DualSense on stage while he was riffing. So it's clearly
that's
some
awesome.
people are noticing, right?
Yeah,
He
it's
brought
great.
up Astrobot.
I mean, imagine how revolutionary that is, especially if you're kind of more casual and you dip in and out, and then you're like, oh shit,
Yeah.
you almost don't realize. I often think about that with the PS5 and even the PS4, where people like stopped playing. Maybe they played Grand Theft Auto 3
Mhm.
on PS2, then they like went to college and they got a wife and everything, and then they come back on in PS4 and they're
Yeah.
like, "Wow, you guys have really been doing some shit here." And I'm like, "Man, you missed. Oh man, you missed a war.
Yeah.
You missed a lot of Stockholm syndrome."
Yeah, I have some friends that don't play as many video games anymore, and they're like, have they gotten better? One of them went to med school, and when he visited me, I had like my high-end gaming PC and was playing Battlefield 1, and he just like sat down to play it. This is the first time he's played a shooter, and it's just maxed out, max graphics, 144 frames per second. And he was just blown away because he's seen nothing but a medical book for years. And it was the Turkish campaign and the Ottoman Empire. And he just played it from start to finish. Like, we were like, "Hey, man, we're gonna go get some drinks." He's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, I'll be right there." And he beat the entire campaign, and then hasn't played games since, I assume, because he knows he just. I mean, yeah. If you compare it to like 20 years ago, gaming has gotten so much better. And I've met people who have been out of the loop, and they say the same.
It's funny too, just on that note, encountering people that know better than to expose themselves to it for too long. I've known people like that too, where they're like, I can't. It's like almost like trying to give a flask to an alcoholic or something. They just seem to have this understanding. And I'll also say you're right about the PS1 controller, not the original one, of course, but the
Mm,
DualShock, in the sense that I think Sony gets shit on a little bit because, and I brought this up in the past, but DualShock 3 was not supposed to be
mm.
that.
Yeah,
They fucked it up and they had to just keep going. So we would have gotten some, I don't know what the hell they were thinking with the boomerang, but it
they
wouldn't
weren't.
have been yeah, exactly. It wouldn't have been 3 generations of the same controller. So you're absolutely right in that respect. I did want to ask you about, and uh, we're talking a lot about hardware, and I don't want to be too general about just what's going on with PS5 only. I know people want to hear more about Xbox as well, but I want to ask you about this thing with PlayStation 5 with the expandable SSD and all of this. And John Harlan wrote in and said, to put it bluntly, why the heck does Sony want me to buy a heatsink? Who does Sony think I am? And I was thinking about this because when I was reading that, I'm like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about.
Me
And I
neither,
was
by the way.
surprised. Yeah, I was surprised too by just why would you even want me to have that kind of access to the hardware if you're going to ask that much of me? It's not like
Can I
it's not
answer
like
it though?
selling. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I answer the question though?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Please, please.
You don't need to do anything. Most SSDs come with a heatsink.
So, so what?
There's nothing to worry about.
Yeah. So what was that? What? Why are they saying that? Like, I don't understand. Um, like,
So, um,
yeah. Go on.
like I've links I can send you. My SSD, which is a Gen 4 SSD, of course not as fast as the PS5s, but if it's faster than the Series X's as well. I mean, it didn't come with a heatsink, but my motherboard like had like a slot with a heatsink on it, so I didn't need a heatsink. But when I look around, most of these come with a heatsink that will fit in the PS5. Like Corsair's just said, yeah, ours works. This concern about adding a heatsink isn't a real concern in my opinion. Like they come with one. If they don't buy that one. You know,
Why would they? I guess that was them kind of covering their ass then in some edge case, saying
because
like,
some of these SSDs, it's an M.2. I don't know if I wish I had one next to me. For some reason, I don't. Like, it's just like this little rectangle that's thin. Half of the time, that's just going to go in a laptop, so they don't put a heatsink on it, and then it just like there's usually like a thermal tape in the laptop you put over it or something. Like that's why they wouldn't come with a heatsink. But any SSD meant for desktop is going to have a heatsink model. You're not going to have to do anything. You just put it in the PS5.
what's stopping them from making? Well, you know what? I'll let Peyton Stone say it. I don't want to. I don't want to step on anyone's toes here in the audience if they submitted a good question. Peyton Stone says, "What's up, fam? Do you guys believe we will ever get to the point where PlayStation releases a base model console and then releases mods that have higher price points that you can add as the home consumer?" Appreciate you, fellas. So we went into this a little bit on your show, and I want to kind of expand on it. This sounds like some sort of modularity that seems like they might have been able to bake in even more. Would you have liked to have seen more modularity than just switching out the SSD? Do you think that would be possible even in a redesign?
I wanted to see that out of the Series X, and I somewhat expected them to. I Some of the early dev kits to me suggested they're kind of preparing for like I think maybe how like Teslas work, I think, where there's just like they've got this interface, you just like slide it out and it'll have the newest APU with like graphics and RAM and everything. Just slide it in. And this is the 2023 model of the upgrade. Like some of the stuff they did with the Series X Like, for instance, the interface for the SSD is actually much more capable than the SSD they put in it. So I'm like, oh, maybe they're preparing for something faster. And maybe they are when it comes to the SSD. But yeah, I really kind of expected Microsoft to do that. Frankly, I expected them to put Windows 10 on it, but they didn't. We talked about that on Broken Silicon. When it comes to
Right.
Sony, my answer is actually no. I don't think they should. I think that, and if you were to ask me 5 years ago, maybe I would have said yes. But with how custom the PS5 is, it's just not. It's greater than the sum of its parts because of how the parts they hand selected to work together. They're not being utilized very well by most devs, in my opinion. But I don't think Sony should. It's kind of like modular laptops, which me and my co-host just talked about on the new Broken Silicon. There's another company, and I see this all the time. We're going to make a modular laptop. You'll be able to get the graphics card, the RAM, everything. It's going to be great. And they always fail. And it's because I think people would want to pay 20% less money for something that's a little thinner and a little cheaper. It's just a little thinner, a little cheaper. If you don't have to worry about modularity, everything in it can be done in a little bit cheaper and more compact way. And I just think for Sony, that's probably the right decision. I would even go as far as to say that I know a lot of PC gamers who like build their PC for upgradability. Most people never get a new, you know, processor. Most people never actually do put in two graphics cards to run in parallel, and you have to like get a big PC so I can put two graphics cards in at once. They never end up doing it. It's like 5% of PC gamers, or 10%, even when that was a popular thing to do 10 years ago. So I don't know. I think Microsoft should, but I don't know that it makes sense for how Sony does their business. That could be a whole podcast discussing if that would make sense.
No, it's I love what you're saying here too, because it really hasn't the PS3 so much less so, but there were like mystery ports on PS1
Hmm.
and PS2 where you could like parallel ports that you could mess around with, and there seems to be less preparation now in having anything on the PS5 or PS4 that's not an Ethernet cable or like a USB port or something. So it doesn't seem like they were even thinking about that, but it's always fascinating to think about the history of games, especially in the 90s. And especially, I always love thinking about the Genesis. It's like, holy shit, this thing turned into like a Gundam basically by the time you were done with it. There were so many things you
Yeah.
could plug into this thing. And it seemed like it was pretty deliberate. I don't know that they, you needed the Mark One or the Mark II for some of it, but I think a lot of people's heads are still there, but I think a lot of that comes from the fact that changes were happening on the fly, and I think these companies are just a little more smart now. They don't want people like me. That's why I wanted to bring up the heatsink thing, because as you're saying, it's almost something you shouldn't worry about. And yet reading that very word,
I didn't
I was
write
like,
it.
oh, I don't know. Well, heatsink, I don't know what I it's too much for me.
Oh, yeah, I mean, all you're gonna have to do with that SSD is make sure it fits, and I'm pretty sure within a month, you're just gonna see every manufacturer on Amazon just put PS5 compatible or whatever on there.
I'm surprised that Sony's not like out with Seagate trying to like stamp their fucking logo on things and sell more, but
Well, they're hard
uh,
to make. Guys, it's really not hype. Whether they're utilizing it well or not, the SSD in the PS5 is as if it skipped 2 or 3 generations from the PS3's hard drive. It's you can't get one on a PC right now still. That's that good, I would argue.
well, let's talk about this power and the precedent being set. Dylan Manchujak wrote into us and said, "Hello, boyos. With Sony's SSD being the major selling point of the hardware, has anyone talked about how this sets console games apart from PC? I assume most PC games have to cater to the lowest common denominator with HDDs in mind, hard drives. Like, is this the first console generation where console games can exceed PC games in the utilization of hardware?" I was interested in this question because I have never seen this being asked until recently. And again, I don't have the expertise to know, but people saying that kind of some of the bleeding edge stuff might be happening on consoles. And that seems unusual. And I don't even know if that's true. I wonder what your interpretation of that is.
So, is it that uncommon? I mean, the Apple M1 chip is actually not all hype. It's mind-blowingly impressively efficient. The new chip that Apple just made. There's new things in non-gaming PCs all the time. Often, usually. What PCs have is the ability to consume 1,000 watts and brute force their way through everything. But if you really set your mind to it, companies can make interesting things all the time. And the PS3 cell processor was stronger than the latest i7 when it came out. It was just impossible to program for most devs. So it
Interesting.
probably wasn't a good decision. It is stronger than the PS4's CPU actually. Again, just it was such a cluster they got rid of it. So like a game like Mag, 256 players, that wouldn't have worked on the 360. Straight up, I'll just promise everyone it wouldn't have. And that's not that. So it's not like this never happens.
Hmm.
And I would argue the PS5 is kind of like the PS3 if it wasn't stupid. Like that's how I've described it. Like let's like really just go for it, try something new, but maybe we don't need to use a processor that's really more meant for servers and like medical imaging than it is for gaming. And maybe we don't need to put like 4 different SD card slots on the front of it for some bizarre reason.
What was the? Do you know what the rationale behind the cell processor was? Like, have they ever talked about that? Because I know it's kind of a blemish for them and something they still have a hard time engineering around today. That's why we don't have full backwards compatibility. Is there any word on that?
I don't, I think there was one point in time where I kind of knew. I honestly am under they put that in smart TVs. They put that in some supercomputers. I honestly think that Sony was trying to make a mega processor they could use in everything. And they just lost sight of common sense while designing it with IBM. That's honestly what I think it was.
Interesting. All right, so with the kind of the pace being set on the hardware, with PC still incredibly powerful, and the differentiation between games and or game consoles and PCs, and also you had brought up all the various chipsets and all the various components in these machines. Someone asked a question here. I don't know if it's ignorant or not, but I want to ask it. And I'm not saying he's ignorant. I don't know if me reading it is ignorant on the show. Josh Correa wrote in and said, "Hello, Tom and Colin. Since the semiconductor chip shortage is the main factor of the lack of supplies for both the PS5 and Xbox Series X and S, do you think Sony and Microsoft will follow Apple's lead by making their own chips? With the overwhelming success of Apple's M1 chip, it feels like it's a no-brainer for Microsoft and Sony to follow this approach to make their own chips in the future." I thought this was interesting because I was always under the assumption that there was some insurmountable technological reason that these companies were all reliant on 2 or 3 global
Mm.
manufacturers. But in seeing Apple kind of strike out on their own, it seems like it's just a very expensive but solvable problem. Do you anticipate that this will happen with the others?
It is. It is a custom SoC designed with AMD, and actually Apple uses the same production TSMC as Sony. So there's so much I could dive into. I highly recommend the Daniel Nenny episode of Broken Silicon. This is someone who founded SemiWiki.com. He's been in the industry working at fabs for decades, and he kind of explained how this all evolved. A long time ago, every electronics company had a silicon fab. They all made their own chips, like literally at their own factory. And over time, they kept shrinking the nanometers, and just less and less companies were capable of making the latest stuff. And the ones that got the best at it didn't just make their own stuff. They started making stuff for other people because of how much of an efficiency advantage or performance advantage you would have making it at them. And we've seen it shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink to just basically TSMC, Intel, Samsung, and Global Foundries. With Global Foundries, I would say as of this year probably being the worst, but still light years above other companies that can only make others like way older stuff for like, your graphing calculator or whatever. Like there's Global Foundries, then Samsung, then Intel, then TSMC. And some people would argue with me about saying Intel's number 2, but I do believe their products at the end of this year will prove they're back in the number 2 spot again. But the fact of the matter is, the number 2 to the number 1 spot, TSMC is just way ahead. Like it's ridiculous. And the reason they're ahead is because they stopped doing ambitious die shrinks, like doubling performance every year, because they knew that was somewhat unsustainable, and also because Apple told them to. Apple said, "We just want a new chip every year. We don't care if it's twice as good. It has to be 20% better because people will just buy the latest thing." And so TSMC stopped focusing on these absurd goals. Like I think Intel's 10 nanometer from 14 aim to be almost 3 times more dense. It's insane. Most of the time you get 50 to 80% more at TSMC. And so, yeah, every year now, TSMC's had this methodology of like, what can we accomplish this year and actually get it out the door? And so if you do that though, every year, 20% times 20, 1.2 times 1.2 becomes an exponential increase. So every few years, TSMC is just doubling performance then. Not every year, like Moore's Law, every few or 3 or 4 years, it's very
Right.
dead. Um, And so basically what happens is Apple gets on the newest node first, 5 nanometer right now, and that's what the latest iPhone is made on right now. And then AMD is their second best partner now. AMD just kind of waits for the newest iPhone to start being made, and then they just gobble up all that capacity and they make PlayStations, Xboxes, gaming graphics cards, processors. And then they kind of just wait for the new node to be ready. But of course, Apple goes first because they pay the most and they come in and swallow up all of that. And so that's all that's going on. All these companies, Apple, Sony, Microsoft, they're all using TSMC. And the reason there's a shortage isn't even capacity. TSMC started making less wafers in early 2020 because they were like, well, the world might be ending, so we assume people will buy less stuff. And what happened is the opposite. The
Right.
people who have money now work inside, don't buy as many lunches, don't commute to work, and now they have more disposable income. They want the coolest gaming hardware. That was a mistake. So TSMC turned their capacity back online. It is back online. They're not even at capacity. There's no capacity issues to make these. The problem is the supplies to make them. The people who make substrate, which I've showed you before, I have a wafer, a silicon wafer
Yeah,
behind
that's
me.
super cool. You said you wanted to make like a tray out of it, which was pretty neat.
Yeah, but it'd definitely shatter if we put food on it, I think. It's like, yeah, let me get some of my toys over here while we're talking. But like, yeah, I mean, like the people who make this substrate, I can't make it in an oven. Like it takes a really advanced company to make these. And so if you're TSMC and you're like, oh, we forecasted we were going to make 30% less. Now we actually need to make like 50% more than what we expected. All of their suppliers of these wafers weren't prepared. And so they're getting more factories and stuff online. And those will be ready by quarter 2 of next year. So it's just a matter of time of just getting this. And, I worked at General Motors and I worked at a supplier to General Motors after that. When someone ordered a new exhaust system, there was like an 8-month lag between making the molds to, the plastic molds, all of that stuff that goes into making a part in a car. And that's just for a car. This stuff's even more complex. So they misforecasted and it will be fixed within half a year. And that's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the supply chain and choices that need to be forecast ahead of time and all that. And although it's somewhat unrelated, it's similar in the sense that there's like a massive apparently problem with vinyl manufacturing right now, and
Oh,
it's affecting. I'm building a pool in my backyard, and it's like totally delayed for like fucking God knows how long because I can't get the liner,
mm-hmm.
and it's like holy Christ. So all these random things are happening out there, frustrating all of us, and I imagine that our sector is far from immune because, like you said, it's so much more complicated. So.
Did I answer the question entirely though? I just want
Well,
to make sure.
I was going to ask you. I wanted to go back and so is it fair to say that it just doesn't? This is such a complicated thing that it just doesn't pay for these companies to necessarily pursue their own. Because even like you were saying with Apple, they're not really making their own, right? Is that a fair?
Well, that's not entirely true. Apple is making their own, but aren't they a $2 trillion company?
Hmm.
So Apple can buy AMD, Sony, if Nintendo, full stop in cash right now if they want to. So yes, Apple is actually designing their own chips, but not everyone's very good at that. And the reason Apple is capable of that is because of how much money they have, and they've bought former AMD, Intel, and Nvidia engineers to do this. So like the Zen processors that AMD's making right now, they were designed by Jim Keller, and Jim Keller also designed the Apple M1 or helped. So that's because they just paid him to come on over to their company and do it. So the reason they co-develop, they co-design it with Mark Cerny is there with AMD engineers helping design this, making sure everything fits their needs. And you just go to AMD because they make some of the best graphics cards and processors anyways. It's far cheaper. Sony cannot afford to, they're not a $1 trillion company. They can't do that. And I don't know why Microsoft would bother either when AMD makes such good products.
This is actually a bit of a tangent again, but I want to ask you this because I'm sure you have some insight into it in me thinking about it now, which is both of these consoles seem very supply constrained.
Mm.
Is it safe to assume that Sony made better deals or have better connections getting these because basically everyone's saying they'll sell every console they can make. So Sony
Mhm.
made 10 million and sold them, and Microsoft made like 6.5 million and sold them. Why why is Sony able to make more machines than Microsoft?
Well, some of this is going to have to get into speculation because there's no way
Sure.
to
Well,
know
that's always fun.
100% for sure.
Right.
But what I can say is that the AMD engineers I've talked to seem to like the Sony engineers a lot. And these relationships are never public, never in front of everyone's faces. But like there were suppliers I worked with in the automotive industry that I can promise you got more business because we liked talking to them more, so that was a thing. Outside of that, I mean, I'm sorry, like betting on Microsoft volume is stupid. Like Microsoft can't even sell as well as the worst selling PlayStation. One generation. 360 sold less. So
Mhm.
if you're reserving capacity at TSMC, and there is a limited amount, and it is always all bought up, then Sony would have probably bought up more, because they forecasted they'd sell more. And they were right, but I do wonder if Microsoft would have just bought up as much as Sony. I bet they would have sold all of them. And when you buy wafers and make wafer agreements, this is the real thing. Outside like those agreements are made like a year ahead of time. So a year ahead of time, Sony's like, "Oh yeah, we're sure we're going to sell 10 million." And Microsoft was like, you know, well, we're more confident now. So, let's buy up enough capacity for 7 million or something. That's really all it is. And what'll be interesting to see is if Microsoft starts trying to outbid Sony, later this year. Outside of that, what I can say is the reason you could get iPhones at the end of last year is I do know Apple was like chartering planes themselves to like ship this stuff. And I heard Sony was as well. So Sony went out of their way to outship Microsoft at the end of last year as well.
Right. And what you're saying is that because of the shipping containers, the container ships being backed up and slow,
Mhm.
that these companies would rather pay a massive premium to airlift
Yeah.
their goods.
Because they want you to own a PS5 before Christmas so you buy all those games for Christmas. The Sony, and I do wonder how much of the margins that they have right now that they were talking about are just because they paid through the nose for they probably lost way more money than expected per console sold at the end of last year simply because they were willing to literally charter custom flights to get those shipments, in giant planes to various places.
Yeah, plane full of PS5s, plane full of iPhones. Fun to think about. This is somewhat of a parallel question, but I want to get into this from Caleb Smidra, who says, "Fellas, what does Tom think needs to happen to ease the chip shortage?" And he's going in a different direction. He says, "What can the USA do to strengthen its presence in the chip market? It's been a running thread throughout the show lately that China poses a massive threat to worldwide commerce. If China takes over Taiwan and TSMC becomes a ward of the Communist Party, what would that mean for the world? Thanks for the content, boys." So this is a political question. It doesn't, and by the way, Tom might not agree with my assessment of the threat of Chinese manufacturing. I think it's, and Chinese just tendrils in our companies. I think it's massively dangerous. But what's going on here? He brings up the situation with Taiwan and TSMC, which could be catastrophic if they're invaded by China. But why aren't
When
we
they're
trying?
invaded.
Yeah, I would assume
We saw what happened to
weird.
Hong Kong. I mean, people
Yeah,
are afraid to
touche.
talk about politics. I was actually thinking about this question a lot before we started recording. And I was just like, because there's like a lot of directions we could go in from here, starting with this question. And I'm just like, being afraid to talk about politics, like, what do you people want me to say anymore? Politics is affecting your life. So you can put your head in the sand if you want, but this isn't like the 90s La La Land anymore. There are real things happening, and the things people are voting for are affecting your games. So that's why we're talking about
Yeah, amen.
politics, because we're
Amen.
not 5 years
Amen.
old.
Amen. Thank you so much. Amen. Hallelujah. Our audience really gets that, and I know your
Yeah.
audience does too. But I always try to warn people in case they want to, stay away from these kinds of conversations. But it is a question as to, and I'm not even talking about the geopolitics of Taiwan and TSMC and all of that, but just generally speaking, what's the rhythm right now in terms of trying to extract these manufacturing plants from, I don't want to say
It's
Asia, but just from
happening.
China? Like, just send them somewhere else. Send them to India or something, like a country we can do business with.
Or gasp, Mexico, someone on our border who
I know
produces
that'd be,
most of our stuff. But I guess some people think they're our enemy now for some reason.
yeah, no, silly.
Um, I mean, and I worked with them a lot being in the automotive industry, people down in around Monterey. But anyways, yeah, I would just say a lot of these companies are, Intel's, I can see it. They're building a fab in Arizona. They're looking to buy Global Foundries right now. Global Foundries, they have a lot of stuff in Europe and the New York area.
Excellent.
I'm sure Intel's doing that for a reason. AMD, I mean, but the thing is, right? All of our iPhones, AMD's products, most AMD, not all, AMD uses Global Foundries still. But most of the coolest products, shall we say, Xboxes and stuff, are made at TSMC. And I don't know what to say except that they should be looking into building in South America if I were them. I would heavily be investing in production in Mexico right now because there is a huge risk there. And I mean, when we look at what happened with Crimea, it's like, yeah, look, guys,
Hmm.
China's going to wait for something to happen in Taiwan, and they'll say, we're offering assistance. So we're going to have to land some people at your airport. Don't worry, we're now in charge of security of the airport. Now we control the flow of people in and out of this island. And I think they're going to try something like that eventually. And I don't have a nice answer to this question, except when I ask people that in the industry, it's unanimous. They go, oh, well, then we're going to go to war with China because we cannot lose Taiwan. All of our stuff is Taiwan is essential to global security now, not just for us, but think about people in Europe. If you think we have it bad, Europe relies on Apple and Intel and AMD, American companies, to produce stuff in Taiwan. So Europe's probably even more worried than we are right now about the security of their chips. They rely on everyone else.
Yeah, I want. It's a great point. I wonder. I mean, certainly there are war gamers and strategists that think about this at the Pentagon all the time, but you would think there's got to be some urgent attempt to say, like, listen, we need to offshore all of this stuff as soon as possible, or you can go in the exact opposite direction. I always I always bring this up with other countries too. It's like, why don't we just give Taiwan statehood? You know,
Oh God,
and then
that wouldn't go over well.
and then they would be, under the hegemony of the United States. Yeah, it would be horrible. That would actually
I
cause
mean,
the war.
yeah, it certainly would. They won't even let them put Taiwan in the map in Disney movies anymore, which is insane. I can't. I could talk about this forever. I cannot get over how insane this is. Like John Cena apologizing in Mandarin. Could you
Oh my god.
imagine if someone in sports or an actor apologized even in French in the 80s? There would have been an uproar. Like, we don't apologize to the French, and they're our ally. Like, could you
It's
like, and yet this is going on. I don't know what to tell you except that it's mind-blowing. It's insane. Taiwan is essential for our security, and China's going to probably try to take it. So I don't know what to tell people. In terms of the rest of the supply chain, there's actually a ton of components that are in a shortage right now due to pent up demand and what's going on right now with so many things after COVID. So all of that's just taking time to alleviate, and all of these companies are just worried that if they fix it, then there'll be a huge price crash. Because like, they don't want the prices to go down. By the way, everybody, they're very happy or willing to pay $1,000 for a graphics card right now.
Yeah, and that's the collusion, whether inherent or not, between government inflation and then businesses wanting prices to remain as high as possible, so that when inflation adjusts, they had made as much money as
Hmm.
possible under the old rules. So it's very well put, and I'm always happy to talk about that stuff here. Let's talk about. Let's see. We have a few other questions. Oh, you know what? I want to talk about PS5 Pro. David
Okay.
Graham wrote into us and said, circuitous symbols. It seems like the PS5 is less behind the curve technologically than the PS4 was at its launch. Do you agree with this notion? And if you do you think this makes an eventual half-step console unlikely? I wonder. We're only 8 months in. This is all hypothetical. There's no reason for them to do anything. They started tweaking things around the edges, making things lighter, different screws and shit like that.
Hmm.
But do you feel like they're going to do a? I mean, they're obviously going to do a revision, but do you think that they'll do a pro model for PS5 at some point? Do you think that will be necessary?
I know they will. 2023.
So that's what your sources say.
Yeah.
So what will that look like?
So I don't know anything specific, and I'm told specifically that I'm not going to be told anything specific because Sony and Microsoft will turn into Gestapo if what they're working on leaks. So no one is even willing to tell me anything because they know there will be an investigation if anything leaks. But I'm pretty sure you're going to get one by 2024. Most likely, I would guess by end of 2023, probably from both companies. The first thing I actually do want to say, though, is yes, I think the PS5 is, well, it's hard to say because the PS4 was actually quite future proof. It had 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is a lot for the time, especially for a console. Its CPU was kind of weak, but well, we'll just run every game at 30 frames a second. Um, you know, the PS5, I feel, could run a lot of games for a very, very long time, and so could the Series X. I'm a little concerned about the RAM setup in the Series X long term, but If it wasn't for the RAM, I would say the PS5 could be the last console almost. I mean, what do you need? You've got a next gen SSD, an 8-core processor, all these co-processors for backing up that processor. I really think the RAM is the one thing that could limit it. So I think if the PS4 lasted 8 years, it's still working today. I see no reason why the PS5 can't last a decade. In terms of what they're going to do, I mean, they're always going to wait for the latest architectures. So I think RDNA 3 or some derivative of that and RDNA 4 is what's going to go into the PS5. I would suspect the leap from from PS5 base to PS5 Pro will be bigger than what the leap was from PS4 to PS4 Pro, simply because AMD is a much better company now and their products are innovating much faster than they were at that time. So I, I don't know. I mean, I think they're going to at least double performance. And if they do that, 4K 60 is easy as heck. And they'll likely be capable, of doing 8K 60, if I'm being entirely honest. If anyone will actually use that is up for debate. I would argue no. But yeah, I mean, I think they're going to over double performance in 3 years. And I also, though, think they're going to charge $600 or more. I actually do.
Well, with inflation and just the cost of doing business, they might be able to say like, listen, this is this is the same as charging you $500 in 2020 and when it comes out. So hopefully that's not true. It would be great if inflation was not that bad, but I think it will be. But since you brought up frame rate, Tom, I did want to ask you, we'll stay somewhat relevant here with Manuel Nesamento, who said, hey, Colin and Tom, as a patron to both of you, glad to see you both together. Thank you.
I recognize
Compared
his
to
name.
previous console generations at launch, the hardware this time around is much more on par with high-end PCs. This allows for 60 or even 120 frames per second gaming on PS5 to be as common as devs and publishers decide. As primarily a PC gamer, I was desperate for this for years. Do you think that the 60 will now be the new norm after console players finally got that sweet taste of smoothness? This has been a big conversation in the PlayStation audience because we are not used to this. And a lot of people are, including me. I used to be like, what is the difference? Like, you could see it, but I was like, what is the difference? Like, who cares? And even when they would give you options, I was like, no, I want the resolution to be higher. I don't know. But then with PS5, they started giving you a taste of both. And I really came around. I was like, wow, this is totally awesome. And I don't know what I was thinking. And so a lot of people are coming to that conclusion on the PlayStation side. Do you suspect that that's the baseline now? I mean, moving forward, I mean, nothing will run at 30 again, right?
To be fair to you doubting 60 hertz, if you go back, and I challenge everyone listening to do this, go back, because I did a video on this a while ago. Go back 20 years and look at graphics card reviews. They weren't talking about 60 hertz back then either, people. They were talking about actually like 24 hertz minimums and 30 hertz as an average. So, I mean, it's not like it's always been the standard. And even if you go back 10 years, the average was 60 with drops to the 40s, and now people complain about that even on console. The PC's been evolving with higher frame rates too. And I mean, I've got a 4K 120 hertz display that I'm using right now to talk to you. Downstairs is a 4K 120 hertz TV. I kind of refuse to get almost anything else now just because I think this will be the standard for the next decade, and I'm just willing to pay 50% more to double my frame rate over 4K 60. Like, I think for sure, I was really sure they would make 60 hertz the standard early 2020. Then right before the launch, I got nervous because I saw Assassin's Creed talking about 30 hertz 4K and stuff. And I was just like, what are you doing? But they updated Assassin's Creed to run it at a higher frame rate before launch. And even the Series S, I believe, launched at like I don't know if it was 1080p 30 frames or 1440p 30, but they later patched in a dynamic resolution for 720p 60 most of the time, and most people say it runs better. So you're even seeing people like Ubisoft patching in 60 hertz, and I'm under the impression Ubisoft hates high frame rates based on how some of their games run on console recently.
Right.
So I think it is the standard, and I think that I mean, look at Resident Evil 8. It just everything seems to be using 60 hertz, and I think it's for sure the new norm, and I hope 120 hertz actually becomes the norm.
That would be awesome. Yeah. You make me feel a lot better because, yeah, I was like, I don't know. I don't get. And then it was just when I started playing games regularly and then you would drop back down. Like I would go play a PS4 game again and it would be like, oh no. And now I really notice it when I'm playing Vita. I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah.
I don't know. You really have some sort of different viewpoint once
A
you're.
lot of those Vita games are running at like 20 hertz though, just like so people know. Like the original Demon Souls, it's like lucky if it was running 30 hertz in any of those areas.
All right. What about? Well, we haven't talked about. You mentioned Switch a little bit. I want to ask you about Steam Deck a little bit. We'll do it through this question from Turbo Makes Games because this is something that just came up on our show. He says, "Hey, Colin and Tom, I've heard you both talk about how cool it would be to have a new PlayStation handheld with an AMD APU to deliver PS4 level performance. My question is, how big would this hypothetical device need to be for sufficient cooling and battery life? In my opinion, the Vita is just about the perfect size for a handheld, but can you really fit a PS4 performance into that form factor? What would you want the next gen handheld to look like?" So, to catch everyone up, and I don't know if you heard it, but and we talked a little bit about this on your show, I think too, but I have this vision since the PS4 will now be the base PlayStation model that will be fully backwards compatible moving forward. So, what I mean by that is like you imagine PlayStation 6 will be able to connect to PS4 and you'll be able to play PS4 games. It seems like they've unified everything. With that being the base, it seems like that would be a pretty interesting handheld to make. And I'm wondering if you think that that would be possible, especially on the back of the popularity of Switch, the revisions that are coming to Switch, and of course Steam Deck gaining a lot of love out there with PC gamers and bringing this question back to the fore on us wanting to see a Sony handheld. So, where's your mind on or at on this question?
So I actually want to start this conversation with a question for you. Do
Sure.
you consider the Switch a handheld?
N- no. Well, it is. I mean, yeah, it is. It's a hybrid that can connect through, just like you connect your laptop to your TV. It's the same thing, like to me. Yeah.
I like that you said your laptop because when I look at the dimensions of the Nintendo Switch, it's 9.4 inches long, over half an inch thick. And then I'm pulling up my NV13. My NV13 is 12 inches long, but then it's 7.7 inches and a half an inch thick. The Switch's dimensions are fairly close to my laptop's dimensions. Would we call a laptop a portable handheld? Because I'm not fitting the Switch in any pocket, guys.
Right.
So,
Right.
and if you look at the Steam Deck, it's huge. Are these really handhelds, people? Are these really portable? Because I think most of you are just playing them at home. I don't, and so
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
that's my question then. When I look at the Vita, this was actually, and this is my opinion, at the limits of what I would consider portable. And you could fit it, and you saw it on stage. He like puts it in his back pocket,
Mm.
like to show he's walking off stage with it. I think that was actually when they were announcing a BioShock for it that never came out. Yeah, I consider the Vita the biggest you would want it to be called a handheld. I don't, and when I look at the Steam Deck, I'm like, people really going to be playing Control below 60 frames in 720p when you could just use it on a big OLED TV? Not to mention that game's pretty fast paced. I don't want to use a Vita joystick. I mean,
Hmm.
you can put an Uncharted on the Vita, but I can assure you I am less accurate than using a controller or a mouse and keyboard. So, all of this is to say, can Sony do it? Of course. They can do anything they want to do. Do they want to? I'm not sure. And I I wouldn't be even interested in it at this point now that we have smartphones. Um Unless it was as big as like I have this Xperia Play here. Like this is what I want. I want this to be so small I can put it in my pocket next to my smartphone. Because otherwise I don't see the point. If I can bring a Switch somewhere, I can bring a laptop somewhere. My laptop has a 2060, a 6 core at 5 gigahertz. It can play in 4K a lot of games on an OLED screen that folds out of it. To me, that's a far better gaming experience than hauling a Switch somewhere on a low resolution screen. So I don't even. I would just challenge everyone asking this question: Are you sure what you want anymore? Because I think the PSP, the DS, the 3DS, and the Vita kind of really nailed the performance and the form factor for the types of games you can play. I think the Switch nailed a certain type of form factor. But I mean, do we want this to be basically a Steam Deck? This is a bigger conversation, because if you do, I think they could make that in 2023, but I don't think they should bother unless they literally fit a PS5 in it, because I think Nintendo finally figured out that you want your library to work on your big TV and on your handheld, because otherwise you got Sony developing games for like, what was it, like PS2, PSP, and PS3 at the same time, and
Right.
you can't play half of them. So I think if they do it, Sony needs to wait to literally make a portable PS5 and it's not they're on 7 nanometer now. That's the Steam Deck uses too. They'd want probably 3 nanometer, and they probably still have to make some cuts. When I talk to developers, they're very happy with the performance of the modern consoles. I don't know if they'd want a teraflops cut for lower resolution. I don't know. I think Sony could do it. I just think they should wait until it's literally a PS5.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just a question people ask. I love that you brought up the form factor too, because it also brings up the question of if you're not going to be able to fit this thing in your pocket, then you can just bring your phone and a DualSense controller.
Yes.
Like so, there is that too, and I think that that is going to be their solution. I want to talk about that in a moment, but since we brought up both Switch and Steam Deck, where's your mind at with? Let's start with Steam Deck. You don't seem like you're a huge believer in it. I think it's cool in the sense that Valve seems they're making it themselves, so they're not just it's not like the Steam machine where it's like, yeah, you make it, and we'll license it. So that shows some sort of belief in it, but I find the layout of the sticks to be peculiar and a
Yeah,
bunch
it's
of other
2
things. So
touchpads for some reason.
yeah, what's so where's your mind at on this thing?
Well, so first of all, why are people buying the Switch? Just admit it. You want to play Breath of the Wild. That's why my friend brought it, that or Super Smash Bros. And in fact, the Switch is pretty cool because even if you're not really playing it like you played a PSP, you can detach the Joy-Me's, and then all of you can just play Mario Kart on this one Switch, right? I mean, it's a very cool, like, communal gaming device that you can bring anywhere as easily as a laptop. That's what the Switch just nailed. It's really good at that. The Steam Deck doesn't have a detachable controller. The Steam Deck doesn't even come with Windows installed. You're going to have to hope that the emulation on Linux works well, and it will sometimes, but sometimes it won't. And most of the time, you're losing 10-20% performance emulating a Windows game. So, with that in mind, then, I know I want to say this. Gabe Newell gave an interview, I believe, to IGN where he said, whatever the Series X can run in 4K, the Steam Deck can run in 720p. To which I would say, well, cool. The Series X usually isn't running games in full 4K, guy. So are you saying then this is a sub 720p console? Because that's what it looks like to me. And I'm just saying this because I feel people are overestimating its performance. It's like 1 to 1.6 teraflops, just like laptops throttle due to heat because it's a portable device. So it's 1 to 1.6. I wouldn't compare this to the Series X. I would say the Steam Deck is around a fourth the performance of a Series S. Does that sound powerful to anyone? you know, it's going to be a sub 720p, sub 60 hertz AAA gaming device. And I'm not playing Battlefield 2042 on that. Are you kidding me? Like,
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Is it seems like a machine for some. I don't know. Maybe like Steam has such an extensive catalog of unimpressively visually unimpressive games,
right.
let's say, that maybe it's for them, like where it's like you want to play, I don't know, Fell Seal and Civ 4 or something. I don't know. I don't know. I just think it's pretty cool that they're putting their name on it. It seems like a weird way for them to come out of hibernation in some way where they only do these very specific things. And so you would think that it was like a targeted
Well,
thing.
so if it can run those low power games and I'm holding up an Xperia Play, then this could probably also have run them and actually fit in my pocket. And so I
Right.
feel like the Steam Deck either should have had two models, a cut down, weaker version that runs emulated game, well, that runs the weaker games well in your pocket, and then a big boy version that is a little stronger than it is right now. In the middle, again, this is for people that love enthusiast PC gaming and then are also okay with not using a keyboard and mouse and gaming below 720p. And I've never met that person. I
Yeah.
think I think this will be for some. This is going to have a niche audience, and I compared it in my last podcast directly to the Vita. There's going to be an enthusiastic group where those people do exist, and they do want to play half of their games on the go, kind of, even though it's not smaller than a laptop. And but it's more portable, I guess. And it's 2-hour battery life though. So yeah, those people will buy it and it'll probably sell 5 million or more. But I'm not convinced it's gonna take the world by storm. And the reason Valve did this is I do think because PlayStation is ignoring the handheld market. They knew that the Super Switch isn't coming out for a couple years. And this is a thing a lot of people don't know. That APU that they're using, I actually leaked it months ago. That was originally designed for, I believe, a specific version of the Microsoft Surface. Then Microsoft never made it. So you've got this almost like custom gaming SoC sitting there on the shelf that they put all this design work into, and then Valve, I think, swooped in and said, "We'll use it." We'll use it because no one else is making a handheld for 2 years. Perfect. We'll use it. This can't fail. This will at least make its money back. And like I think you talked about that on the show, how they're a conservative company. And I think that's what it is. It was a perfect storm of the perfect time to make this device, and we'll see how well it does. But I don't think it's perfect, and I think a lot of people are gonna buy it because it's cool and then end up not using it like Avita did, you know?
I think you're probably right. And yeah, they are a conservative company. They are very happy just taking their 30% rips on games. Like they don't need to do anything. They stop making games for the most part.
Yeah.
So it is very interesting to think about it from that perspective. But we'll see. You brought up the so-called Super Switch. What's going on with this? We know that there's like a new Switch coming out, but this is not what you're talking about. You're talking about something else.
So, and a lot of this came from Bloomberg, where everyone started believing it like gospel, And I said this, I just did an NVIDIA Lovelace and Super Switch leak. It's on the Moore's Law's Dead YouTube channel if you guys want to watch it, where I did a very deep investigation. I came to the conclusion that Bloomberg is an established news source. They have very good sources, but I'm, to put it blunt, under the impression they are technologically stupid, that they have no clue what they're hearing when they talk to people at these factories. And what they heard is like a picture of the OLED switch, and it's like, look, a new switch. And then from another source, they heard they're designing a new SoC, and they didn't understand that that means that OLED model is something else because it takes years to get an SoC out the door. And so they just thought, oh, it must be the same thing. You know, I think would encourage everyone, and I said this in my video, to go look up when the 3DS XL came out. Less than 2 years before the Switch. Go look up when Nintendo releases their last piece of hardware. It's usually within 2 years of the next one. So I'm under the impression that the Super Switch is coming out maybe even late next year, but certainly by the end of 2023, and that it's going to have some custom version of the NVIDIA Orin chip. I'm actually under the impression that it's going to get a extra special version on a smaller node with the latest Lovelace graphics that aren't even out yet, possibly on desktop by that time. And the reason is that Nintendo, when they designed the Switch, really wasn't doing very well. I mean, compared to now. And Nvidia was more focused on self-driving. But now that they know the Switch is going to sell over 100 million units, just like AMD knew the PlayStation would, I think Nvidia is going to custom design them a version that's far more capable than what the Switch was for its time. The Switch used Maxwell graphics from 2015. It was 2017 when that launched. They were 3 gens behind, just like the Wii U actually was. So, I don't think that's going to happen this time. I think Nintendo's got more money. I think Nvidia knows that Nintendo is going to sell a lot of units with the next one, and because of that, Nvidia knows that if devs are programming for the Switch, the Super Switch, then they know that their latest desktop graphics cards will be well optimized by devs. And that's what AMD's bet was with the PS4. So,
That's interesting. So they get like a little something on the back end from doing this. So
oh,
they get data or information or whatever.
they get better, like, because Nvidia's architectures are entirely different than AMD's half the time. They get better efficiency out of their cards. I mean, Nvidia owns like 80% of the gaming desktop market, but then AMD also sells like 40 million Xboxes, well, 20 million Xboxes and PlayStations combined a year. And that makes sure devs utilize Radeon graphics cards well. I mean, imagine if Sony went with graphics that were not GCN, which has been the AMD standard its entire life. So then you'd have devs optimizing for some ancient hardware, and the desktop cards wouldn't have benefited. That's what's happened with NVIDIA's. They're probably not happy about it. So I think they're going to put something stronger than the Steam Deck in the Super Switch, like quite a bit stronger, actually. I think it might be very impressive.
Will the form factor be similar, you think?
I have no clue. Like, I don't know anyone who can tell me what it is, but I mean, look at how well the Game Boy Advanced SP sold, and then the 3D, then the DS, then the 3DS. I mean, they basically use the same form factor for 3 gens when they hit a home run. I doubt they use a radically different form factor.
So this brings us back. I mean, it's fucking endlessly circuitous, but with Nintendo doubling down and certainly their rivals knowing this, I assume people at these different, I assume all these companies know what they're doing, each other's doing in
Yeah, they
some
do.
way. Do they leave it uncontested? I mean, does Sony still leave it uncontested? I mean, it brings us back to this question. Like it just seems to be the market demand. There seems to be so it almost brings us into a question I have about Andy Capt wrote into us about streaming and PlayStation Now. And I guess we can segue that into, is that just going to be the solution? Or are they eventually going to get this thing working to such a degree where they're like, listen, we're not making another fucking PlayStation Portable. So we've partnered with Netflix or whatever ends up happening. We're going to have really high fidelity, streaming. So what's going to happen in this sense? I mean, because it does seem weird to me. A market like Switches sucks in competitors usually, and for some reason it's just repelling competitors, and I don't really understand that. It just seems like there's money to be made there.
I mean, there is, and I actually want to read part of it. Andy Capt is the person you're referencing. His question was, why is PS Now behind the curve when it comes to streaming? And I wrote for my answer, why did the PS Vita TV not have Netflix support? I don't know, because Sony's fucking stupid sometimes. I don't know why they do what they do half the time. I don't know why Microsoft does what they do half the time. These companies are just blunder all the time. And Sony was in charge. They had the most popular streaming game service, I believe, 4 years ago, and now it's way behind several competitors. And there's this hunger that Sony had in the PS3 gen where they're always innovating. We're not just going to add achievements. We're going to add trophies, and that's better. We're not just going to make a few exclusives. We're going to just swamp the industry with all these exclusives. Not all of them will sell well, but whatever. Everyone's going to want to buy at least a few of them every year. There was this, I mean, think about PS Plus, like you can upload your saves, and like there's all these things, and that was a hungry Sony that was trying to make everything better consistently for 5 years. And I just, like, you look at PS Now and it's like it was the best, and then they didn't do anything with it. I don't know, they should have been innovating every year, because this is a cutting edge competitive space. It'd be like if Tesla made a self-driving car once and then was like, yeah, well, guess what, we're not improving autopilot. Well, then you're gonna get beaten by General Motors eventually if you just sit around. And I don't know why. I don't know what Sony's doing. I don't know why they're doing some of the things they do. I think they're getting a grip a little bit, and that I was much more worried about them before the gen started. Early 2020, I was like, oh boy, I hope this isn't 2006 Sony. I don't think it is.
No, I don't.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what they're doing with streaming, because it should be, they have the tech. What I keep assuming is they're preparing some big overhaul, but they have to, I don't know.
I assume that too. And it's funny, my mind has also gone to, because you were talking about like their capability with PS Now. They did cut the line by acquiring Gaikai at that time, and they may have never been fully able to deal with the ramifications of this technology. In other words, they just absorbed another company, and they're like, yeah, your technology is great, and we're just going to fold it in the PS Now. And then they're like, we don't know what else to do. So do you feel like this rumor with Netflix has any teeth?
So when I saw that rumor, and to be fair, I haven't asked anyone about it. I don't know anything outside of like seeing. I even have to ask you. Like, they just found some pictures of like Ghost of Tsushima and a controller, right? In the
they
code.
scraped like a picture of Jin and a picture of a DualSense and stuff off of Netflix itself.
So that, and seeing both of those next to each other, like if it was just an Uncharted picture, I'm like, maybe they're going to advertise the Uncharted movie. And I think Netflix has a deal with Sony on those movies.
They do, right? And there is all of these like,
so it's like, is it just that? I don't know though. Why did they have a picture of a controller in it?
Well, because people bring up this stuff all the time where it's like, and I've been in these meetings where it's like you have a deck, right? And you're like, I'm proposing. This happens in game dev a lot, often, where it's like, we have Indiana Jones, and it's like literally Indiana Jones, and we have Halo, and they show like Master Chief, and someone was brought up I think a pretty relevant point, which was like, maybe someone was giving a presentation like that. And I'm like, yeah, but why would it be on Netflix's server as opposed to, it's not like some PDF someone found. It's literally uploaded and was scraped. So someone put it up there. And I'm like, I don't know anything about this stuff either, but my outside thing is like, why? Because people are like, well, what would Sony and Netflix want to do with each other? And I'm like,
I can guess.
Kidding me? I mean, Sony would be like, oh, that's really cute. You guys have 30 million subscribers on Game Pass. We have like, 500 million now, or whatever the hell, insane global number reach, 100 million. And I'm like, so
that's why I like this rumor though.
Right. But the reason I don't like the rumor is because I don't know what Netflix would want from PlayStation. That's my problem. I know what Sony would want from Netflix.
Okay. I can guess a couple things. So if I remember correctly, I believe the PS3 was the most popular Netflix streaming device not last now, it's 2 gens ago because I'm so old. Um, for a while. I believe it was. It
It
like
was, and it got more popular. You'll remember that Netflix had to run off of a disc on PS3 because they had some sort of exclusivity deal for downloads with Xbox, and once that expired, then it started to
then it
explode
th
on PS3.
then they
Yep.
could add an app. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. My cousin had a Netflix disc. What the
Yeah, you
heck?
had to put it in and, like, select it from the cross media bar.
Well, you'll like this. I believe that was like in 2009, and that was before. Yeah, I was a kind of a Luddite in high school. Like like my cousin was like, "You gotta try Netflix streaming," and I'm like, "Why? Why would I stream something when they can just deliver a DVD?"
Yeah. You never know what you need in these spaces until
Yeah.
someone shows you. That's why my mind is always open to everything.
I
So
mean, you'd hope you learned the lesson enough, like I have now, to stop doubting everything. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I really doubted like smartphones too for a while. But like, when it comes to Netflix, I think it's very simple. It's like, we know that we were the most popular streaming device at one point, and now every PlayStation has Netflix pre-installed. And perhaps what they do is Sony's big overhaul, perhaps, is bundling Netflix and PS Now in PS Plus and trying to make some greater package. And the reason both companies would want to do this is Sony's like, hey, every PlayStation account comes with Netflix. Like, dude, like, a lot of people share one Netflix account anyway. So how much is your account really worth? We'll
right.
give you like half off if we can bundle it with every new PSN account. That's what they could do. And then they could also stream their games through Netflix, which I think everyone expected Google Stadia to do really well. And as far as I'm aware, it actually is doing way below what they expected. Everyone thought because Google's an internet company, for sure their streaming tech will be the best. And from what I've seen, it's just horrible, worse than PS Now, worse than xCloud, horrible latency. It's just hilarious. I just don't even understand what Google does half the time. And so, but who does have good streaming tech? Netflix. And if you're
Right.
Netflix, and let's just be honest, every corporation's goal is to become emperor of the galaxy because that's how, capitalism works. Well, the next place to go is game streaming. Okay, well, if the next place to go is game streaming, um, who could help us with that, and Netflix is worth way less money than Microsoft, I believe, and so is Sony, and they're like, hey, we're about to both get steamrolled by Microsoft in the next 10 years if we don't combine forces. That's what I think could be going on, but all we have is 4 pictures. I think it makes a ton of sense, though. I really, really, really do think it would make sense for Sony to stop this, like, and look at what Sony's done with, like, kind of their clubs and PlayStation. What were they called? The PlayStation communities or
Oh,
something?
communities, yeah, on PS4. Yeah, they shut that
And
down. Yep.
they just shot that in the back of the head. But it's probably because they're partnering with Discord. So why would Sony make their own PlayStation communities if Discord's better? Why would Sony make their own streaming platforms and movies platforms if they can just kind of merge with Netflix?
Right, exactly. And you hit the nail on the head because what did they do a few months ago on PlayStation Network?
Mhm.
They shut down the movies and TV section of it.
Oh, I forgot that. I haven't bought a
So,
movie on PlayStation Network for like 10 years.
yeah, like you could, when you do like the universal search, and sometimes the only option was the PlayStation Store. That's the only time I would ever buy or rent something from them. But they got rid of all of
Oh.
that, and people were like, "Why would you?" I remember even saying like, "Why would you do
Mm.
that?" We found out that running the PS3 and PS Vita stores, both of them globally, cost them less than $1 million a year. Imagine how little it costs them to keep those stores open, even if they're making nothing on them. So shutting them down
There's
is part
something
of
that
yeah, it's part of a larger play. And PS Now is actually being fed better and better games recently. Like Nier Automata just
yeah.
came and Undertale and everything. So they're going on that. And I feel like it would be interesting fuel. I like what you're saying about combining things and stuff. I just think them saying like, listen, like PS Now is powered by Netflix,
You know
and
what's
it's
annoying about
yeah,
Netflix? You can't buy movies like you can on Amazon Prime, huh?
yeah,
Whose has a history of selling movies? Sony's own store.
right.
There's room here for a merger the more I'm talking about
No,
this,
you're
where
absolutely right. We're definitely figuring this out, I think, in
I
some
think
way.
that's if there's something to this for sure, it's so they can better compete with Amazon Prime Video, with with Microsoft, because Microsoft's not going to stop if they get Game Pass working well. They're for sure going to start trying to move into streaming. I mean, come on, like, so this is a way for Netflix and PlayStation to combine and kind of blow everyone else out of the water if they do it competently, which there's no promise of that. But if Netflix is involved, I don't think they're going to let it, fall apart. They wouldn't. This would be a huge initiative.
No, definitely. And I also, you're absolutely right in the sense that There is a little bit of a history there. There's a little bit of a need. And in this consolidation, in this consolidating period we're in tech especially, the companies are probably looking at each other being like, our best protection against consolidation is each other.
Mhm.
If we all want to remain independent, then we actually, it's kind of the principle behind Hulu, the original Hulu, which was like
Yeah.
NBC and Fox and others being like, we're going to die. And eventually like they all divested from it anyway. But
I guess they all just decided to die. That is unless you're a huge Peacock fan.
right, exactly. Well, isn't it weird? That was what was so
Yes, it's
frustrating.
stupid.
Hulu was a reminder to me when it came out where I'm like, oh, they get it. The
Yeah.
best way to compete and give value is for them to all combine. And then like 3 years later we have EA Play and like UB Pass and all. I'm like, oh my God.
Why
Jesus.
didn't you play an Origin combine? I don't know.
Yeah, or
It's
like
dumb.
now I'm still hoping like Square Enix and others like realize, oh, we should get together. Like why Bandai Namco, Square Enix, etc. Platinum, like everyone get together and make their own streaming service.
Well,
But
it's
anyway,
gonna happen whether they like it or not, and it's not happening on their terms. Now EA Play is being practically absorbed by Microsoft. They should have merged with Ubisoft. They would have had a lot more power.
Jack Reynolds wrote in about something I wanted to just touch on. We're getting close to the end here, but he says, hey there, Tom and Colin. I feel like now is the perfect time to ask this question. Every gamer is now accustomed to the idea of e-currency, whether it being V-Bucks to Call of Duty dollars. It's now commonplace. Do you, however, think that gamers and even the whole industry is ready for cryptocurrency financial implementation? There are already a couple of big cryptos using Unreal to create marketplaces and virtual spaces. There are so many uses for the technology. I want to ask you this because, well, I want to set the precedent too for the audience, although they know. I am really ignorant on this stuff. Even once people sit down and talk to me about it, I'm like, I still don't really get what you're saying. But what I understand about cryptocurrency and about crypto, what has been drawing my mind as I've been reading about it, is that I think Peru is the most recent country. There are certain countries
Isn't it
that are like,
Bolivia?
or Bolivia maybe, where they're like creating a reserve in their central bank for crypto and all of this. It reminds me that I guess what I'm saying is that there are smart people in these various random places that seem to understand what looks like is going to happen. And I'm wondering how you feel about the possible integration of crypto technologies, not only for money, but everything into our gaming sphere. I think they just found a farm of PS4s that they thought was for crypto mining, but it ended up being for FIFA.
Yeah,
something
for
like that.
FIFA characters or
Yeah.
something, which I don't even know about. Is El Salvador made Bitcoin its official legal currency?
El Salvador. There you go. Yeah, I knew it was like some Central or South American country that made the play. I mean, they made the play. Who knows if it's going to work or not?
So I've been involved in crypto since 2013. So I'm a long hauler on like Bitcoin and stuff. But I do say Bitcoin and stuff because the latest, I'm just going to say it, shitcoin is not Bitcoin. And I do worry how often people just bring up Cumrocket is something Elon Musk is recommending. I mean, guys, these are fucking scams. Bitcoin's the real one. Get out of here. And I wrote it. My first article on my website was about Bitcoin, and it was like what you need to know, what you need to understand before you can try to understand Bitcoin, because you've kind of got to be deprogrammed. I feel like to even get the idea of what makes it work. Because I mean, I think people are starting to wake up now because it's like inflation's happening, whether you like it or not. It's affecting your life, people. And Bitcoin was created to stop that, or give you an alternative without getting too deeply into that, which I'll talk about as much as you want. But in terms of like, do you think that gamers in the whole industry are ready for cryptocurrency implementation? Yeah. I use Bitcoin all the time. You just press a button, you send it. It's very quicker than my credit card. I don't see what the big deal is about why it would be a problem. The thing is, though, I don't think Activision wants to use Bitcoin. I think they want to use their V-Bucks or whatever, and there will be companies that just want to use their own tokens. I think all that you need to do is add Bitcoin integration and you're done. And I don't think there's going to be really any big other thing that challenges Bitcoin in that space. They're just all going to, I mean, I don't know how many things I need to bring up of how many failed projects there are that were like, we're going to put this on the blockchain. It's like a blockchain is just no, you're not. You're just using a decentralized database. We've had those since the 70s, but now that it's a cryptocurrency, it's magic. A lot of these are scams. It's actually a pretty long discussion about what that even means.
I mean, I've gotten that vibe too, just looking at some of these coins or some of these, that are worth like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a penny, and
I
some
love
people
their
buy.
websites.
It's like, well, I don't know what's going on over there, but it's interesting because I think one of the major fears, like, because you said like the V-Bucks, like they definitely want you to buy V-Bucks, but
Mhm.
they don't make V-Bucks available to buy with Bitcoin yet. And they probably would want you to spend Bitcoin more than any other like USD or Euro because they can probably hide it. And I think that I think that
Is it
there's
called
two
V-Bucks?
or whatever it is. That's the Fortnite money. So that would be Epic
Oh,
coins.
okay. Well, let me check if you can buy it, because I think people say you can't and you can. Actually, yeah, you can. You can
You
buy V-Bucks with Bitcoin.
okay, so there you go. I feel like the major reason why I think companies are scared of it is the similar reason you hear about why a lot of pot dispensaries, even in states that are legal, only
Mm,
take cash because it's not the federal illegality. It's that like they can literally RICO your entire
mhm.
savings account and be like, oh, this is all ill begotten. And I think dealing with crypto encourages the investigative eyes to pry from the IRS and these others that are going to start really going after this stuff. And I think a lot of companies are kind of waiting for other companies to be like, how do we do this? Because the second this happens, we have a whole nother thing to deal with. Remember when you didn't pay taxes for online purchases for years? People forget
Yeah.
about that. That
Yeah,
like
that's
for 20
awesome.
years you just
Doesn't
weren't
make
paying
any
taxes.
sense too.
It was awesome.
It was the
But
best.
eventually people were like, how the hell are you getting away with this? And then they now you pay taxes when you buy
Well,
Amazon. You know,
their answer was, "Well, you're not making us, so."
right? That's exactly right. And I feel like companies are smart enough to know like when we're getting involved in these extra governmental currencies, it's going to invite all of this shit into our lives from the government. And the government has no idea what it's even doing in this regard yet. So I think they're maybe trying to be as patient as possible. But I'm sure if you go to Epic's website, they would love for you to spend nothing more than Bitcoin as
Well,
opposed to
so
yeah.
it's Bit Refill is where you can just get gift cards with Bitcoin, and I would recommend anyone who wants to. You can just buy everything on Bit Refill, this is a real. This isn't a shady one, and there are shady ones. This is a real company, based like in the West that like fully pays their taxes and stuff. But they sell gift cards, and they accept Bitcoin, and they accept Lightning Network transactions, which I probably don't need to get into that. But I think the first thing we should do is ban the U.S. dollar, because that's what most crime is used for. Like, I mean,
That's
how I'm going to
exactly right.
stonewall this as much as I can, because when we start talking about worrying about Bitcoin, it's like, I mean, you're losing me. The U.S. dollar is the most used thing for crime. So,
It's absolutely right. When I heard that argument for the first time, I was like, "Oh yeah, I mean that is a good a good argument." Tom, let's wrap up with this question from Dexter Wallingsford, who it's a simple one. Says, "Hello, Colin and friend. If the SSD was the technological leap that separates PS5 from PS4, what leap is in store for the next generation of consoles?" So, what is out there in the ether that if we have a PlayStation 6 in 2027, I don't know, what would this machine look like? What would be the thing that draws us like the SSD and the DualSense does today?
it would depend on which developer you ask for what they want, which is interesting. Like, I just had Brian Heemskirk on from Massive Damage Games. They make Halcyon 6 and Star Renegades. And I asked him, what do you wish the consoles had more of? And he was just like, well, most of my friends would say RAM, but I'm going to say teraflops. Give me 100 teraflops and I'll just put explosions everywhere. That's what he wants. Um, but when I recently, the last guest episode for Broken Silicon was actually a VFX artist at Sony Santa Monica, which I don't know if fans of this show will know what they make, but he may have dropped some hints on some upcoming God of War games, so you might want to check that out. But he wants more RAM, and I do think that's a weakness. But I think RAM's going to evolve. For people listening, Intel made something called Optane. It's in between RAM and storage. I would argue that's what Sony kind of tried to accomplish with the PS5, actually, before it was even standard. Um, and I think what you're going to see is several interfaces. We're probably going to have a console that, if I had to guess, was 100 teraflops, actually. And people will say that's not possible. I'm like, give it 5 years, guys. Um, I think it'll be like 100 teraflops. I have no idea what the CPU will be. Maybe 16 cores, maybe just 8 cores because they don't need any more. And then you're going to probably have like 32 gigabytes of RAM. And then you're going to have like, if I had to guess, half a terabyte or something of in between storage, whether it's Optane or a competitor to Optane. So, some sort of like, it's way faster than an SSG, just way, 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 way faster. But it's not as fast as the latest RAM. And they're just going to load all games into RAM. And then there's your instant load times for sure. Um, and I mean, like, just to make sure I answer the question, like, let me find that tier. What was the name of the person who asked the question?
Dexter Wallingsford.
There it is. Yeah. So, I mean, what's the next technological leap going to be? I mean, SSDs were long overdue. And the fact that both consoles have them is, I don't know if that's going to be matched by anything except that the next innovation, unless it's something that I'm not even aware is a thing yet, which is entirely possible, that in 5 or 6 years, they just have something in these consoles that we didn't think they could have. I really think the next technological leap is going to be multiple tiers of storage. You're just going to have, how many cores you need, way more teraflops because that always happens every gen, and then some amount of RAM, and then another tier of like slower RAM, and then another tier of a super fast SSD, and then maybe even a hard drive behind that. And you're going to just have like all of these tiers of storage to like stream things quickly. And if they do that correctly, we'll see how well we need to see. We need to see what Naughty Dog and the new God of War actually do. If they actually do what Mark Cerny said, like streaming in assets as you're walking to save on performance. So far, they haven't really proven they can do that, to be fair. Besides maybe Ratchet and Clank. But if they can do that, I think you're going to see them do that even more, and you're going to see games that really do have no load times. And I mean, I mean, it'll be capable of photorealism. I think the next leap is just going to be that, unless it's too expensive, because that console to me sounds like even in 5 years might be $1,000.
Yeah, they'll have to keep that in mind as well. Of course, the cost parameters and the expectations, the tolerance. I think getting PS5 up to $500 created a new level of tolerance where people are like, okay, you can't imagine anything being this like less expensive than this out the gate, as
Yeah,
opposed
it's
to
funny,
yeah.
isn't it? Like, we thought that 600 would be suicide because of the president's the PS3 set, but now that the PS5's 500, I'm not so sure it would have been. I think everyone would have bought it at 600 actually.
Yeah, I wonder if they look at that and they said, like, we might not, with the supply constraint, we might have been able to
Mhm.
extract a lot more revenue out of this. But they they did it the way they did it. I'm excited to see this too from a design perspective, because we often talk about it on Sacred Symbols that I'm amazed at the SSDs, um, the encouragement that the SSD gives designers to
Yes,
redesign
they
games in
love
different
it.
ways. Like no more long hallways, no more elevator rides. No, when I was playing Resident Evil Village, I remarked it was amazing,
Mm.
like how things were moving from point to point, and yet you could still see where they were
Mhm.
hiding things for to make up for the last gen. Like Duke is still on an elevator in that building, and you still have to go to all. So
I
I'm
pushed the
excited to.
VFX hardest on that a lot at Sony Santa Monica. Like, is the last gen God of War really not holding it back? Like, and I tried to get as much of an answer as possible out of him. His
Of course it
answer,
is.
well,
Yeah. What
his
do you say?
answer was that it basically isn't, is my interpretation of how he said it, but that because the way they pace the game is already kind of built with that in mind. But then I, of course, brought up the loading tree because the tree was just one big loading elevator. Let's be honest.
Yeah, it was totally. I said it a million times. Like that 1% or 2% of God of War, they just didn't get it right. The important,
Hmm.
the map, the quick travel, the fluidity of it, they fucked it up. I mean,
So his
the
answer
game is
was
great. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
his answer would be that without him saying it, because I mean, he works for Sony. He's got to be careful. My interpretation is that this game started as a PS4 game, anyways. So, like,
I
we're
don't know
gonna,
that for sure. I would believe that. I mean, I know Horizon did. I'm
yes,
Everyone broke that news like months after I told everyone on Sacred Symbols. You experienced the same stuff on your show where you say things and everyone's like,
oh
and then
yeah.
they pretend it's news like later. I didn't hear that about God of War. It's possible. I know Horizon that's true.
So
Horizon was only going to be a PS4 game. So yeah,
right, yeah, and that's why I don't think it's a problem. For example, that the Horizon's on the PS4. It was always
I
going to
agree.
be. So who cares? But what I will say about God of War is, I bet the story was written like it's on PS4, and he explained how, like, well, if we remove all load times, though, isn't that when the characters are usually talking to each other? When you're walking between sections? And doesn't that pacing break up the action so the action feels better? To have these, because otherwise you can't just bombard people nonstop like the movie Hardcore Henry, just nonstop, everyone shooting at you. You have to have these quiet moments so the big moments feel big.
Sure,
That was what his answer was, which is a very good answer to
it
that
is.
question. But it's half true what would the one that annoys me if we're talking about the cross-gen stuff, by the way, is Gran Turismo. It doesn't make any sense to me that that's on PS4. That's for sure going to hold it back. Um, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of what else I was going to say though. I mean, when it comes to the SSD and loading stuff, I don't know. I think the biggest thing, yeah, that's what I was going to say with the SSD is the devs like how much easier it makes it to write code. Like they don't have to do entire things they used to have to write for a console. And I think that's also a major asset to the PS5 often performing as well as the Xbox, even in scenes where it probably shouldn't, where that extra teraflops does matter. It's the devs don't really have to optimize on the PS5 because the SSD and the IO controllers handle all of it for them. And yeah, I mean, that's why you saw a lot of the launch games actually run worse on Xbox.
Is it? I mean, this is what you listen to the show, so I go into these where I preface what I'm gonna say. But I'm like, this might be incredibly ignorant. You were bringing up RAM before, and I was thinking they were saying, and you're seeing it actually demonstrably, games becoming smaller. I
Mhm.
know a lot of people bring up Call of Duty or whatever, but there are games on PS4 that
He
are
used to
actually.
work at Treyarch, by the way, too, so he had a
Oh,
lot to say about what
oh, I
was
can only
going on with
imagine.
that.
And like, so I noticed with Doki Doki Literature Club, which is a small game, it was like 2.5 gigs on PS4 and 1.7 gigs on PS5. And so I bring this up only because I was like, would RAM would RAM constraints not be a big deal because they don't have to load in like 17 instances of something anymore? Is that ignorant to
Right.
say, or is that
No,
true?
it's not an ignorant question because why would we know? And that was a direct question I had for the VFX artist at Sony. So VFX artist makes the explosions guns. He made the lasers and machine guns in Black Ops Cold War. That was his job, is to make those
That's super
look
cool.
cool. I know he's a and he can't say what he's working on now, but one can discern he's making like spells and fire in the new God of War. And surprise, it kind of sounds like Sony Santa Monica's probably working on something else as well.
Yeah, I would
But
imagine.
like, his answer to the RAM was the first time I've heard someone explain it this way. Cause I was like, is more, because it was so interesting that the guy from Massive Damage Games said, I don't need more RAM. I just want more teraflops. He said, if you give people enough time, this is the Massive Damage Games guy, they can fit stuff into less RAM. Look at what they did on the Switch. And the VFX artist said, well, you can fit maybe the same gameplay sometimes, but here's what you're missing. He said, when they fit The Witcher 3 on the Switch, I can assure you there's less types of flowers. I can assure you there's less types of trees. What they would do then is just duplicate 3 different types of trees in different directions all over the map. And so the map looks less real. When Geralt shoots fire out of his hand, you don't notice this, but actually, in Demon Souls, every time you cast a spell, the spell looks slightly different. It doesn't look like the same sprites coming out.
Oh,
More RAM means that when you shoot a flamethrower, it doesn't look like on N64 the same JPEG just
right.
appearing on screen. And I said, "Why?" And all this came
Interesting.
from me asking, "Why did Fire look so garbage on the PS3?" And he's like, "Because it took up no RAM to use a JPEG." like we couldn't fit really good looking Fire. He's like, "I don't know how Gorilla did it, but somehow they did." You know, that's what more RAM allows you to do. Every time you turn on the flamethrower, the fire, the fluid or gaseous substance coming out comes out at a slightly different looking angle. When you cast a spell in Demon Souls like Soul Spear, that blue light starts warping in a slightly different position out of the wand. And so if you have less RAM, now guess what? Now the Red Dead Redemption can only have 2 types of berry bushes because we can't put 3 in there, you know. And the SSD also helps you stream from different parts of the storage from the same time. So that helps with that somewhat, but RAM solves it more. I mean, he said if you gave me 32 gigabytes, I'll fill it up tomorrow. Like so, yeah, I that's what more RAM does, and that's the first time I feel like a week ago I've actually been able to answer that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's super interesting to think about all that goes into a game, but also like you said, with the different disciplines, who wants what. And this brings us back to the amazing symphony of listening to all of this feedback and then making a console. Like, how do you
Yeah.
know who to listen to? Like, how do you know whose demand it needs to be met? And it's very interesting.
He said
I
it
like that.
affects AI too. Like for AI, and I remember there was like a behind the scenes for Killzone 2, and they showed like the command because Killzone 2 had very smart AI. I would argue smarter than Shadowfall for some reason. And that's because they had this really deep and complex like tree of decision making for each Hellgas soldier. More RAM means you could have more types of AI thinking differently at the same time. In fact, now I wonder if Shadow Falls AI was dumber because the CPU was weaker than the PS3.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, this is awesome. I mean, I got to go back and listen to that episode. That sounds interesting. Sony doesn't give me anyone to talk to, so
They didn't give me anyone, by the way. He just was willing to talk.
Oh no, I know. Sometimes you're in a position powerful enough at a studio too, where you're like, I don't care. What are you gonna do? You're gonna fire me?
That's what he said.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, Tom, I appreciate your time today. This was a great conversation. I hope to have you back in the future to talk more about all the things I don't understand.
Of course, one of the reasons I started Moore's Law is Dead was that I don't understand why there's either PC Master Race people or Luddite console people. And I'm not even talking to, Colin's waving his hand, but I don't mean like people playing games or like you do these deep dives on companies. I mean, like, I just cannot comprehend why IGN, for example, would do a breakdown of the specs, or The Verge would do a PC building thing, and they don't know what they're talking about. Like, I don't know everything about the business for the games. I mostly focus on like AMD and Intel, like those types of companies. And I don't know everything about like the cache system and Alder Lake from Intel coming out soon, but I can try to focus on the in between. And there's just, the consoles are fascinating pieces of hardware. Like, and there's so much that goes into, I mean, that's when you need a good engineer, because you can't just make a giant box with 100 teraflops using 1200 watts. It's balancing cost and thermal. There's so much to discuss. So, I mean, I could talk about this. I usually talk about mostly PC stuff on my channel, although I just did a giant Switch leak. So I guess I talk about whatever I want. But I would love to come on anytime to talk about any of these pieces of hardware, because I find them endlessly interesting.
Cool. We'll definitely have you back. You did a great job. I'm sure the audience is going to love this episode. So thank you for your time, Tom. And thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support of all things Sacred Symbols and Last Stand Media. We'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.